In a recent video, I explained how transgender ideology harms women. In this video, I want to explain how transgender ideology also harms men. Admittedly, women are harmed more by trans ideology than men, given the epidemic of rapid onset gender dysphoria in adolescent females, and the fact that allowing men in women's spaces presents a greater safety and privacy risk to women than the opposite. Still, many of the reasons transgender ideology harms women are also applicable to men. So if you watch that video, you'll hear many of the same or similar arguments here, in addition to a couple of new ones. One thing you need to know before we proceed is what the Equality Act is. The Equality Act passed the House in 2019 and in 2021, but never passed the Senate and thus never became law. The summary of the 2021 version of the Act states the following. This bill prohibits discrimination based on sex, sexual orientation, and gender identity in areas including public accommodations and facilities, education, federal funding, employment, housing, credit, and the jury system. Specifically, the bill defines and includes sex, sexual orientation, and gender identity among the prohibited categories of discrimination or segregation. The bill expands the definition of public accommodations to include places or establishments that provide 1. Exhibitions, recreation, exercise, amusement, gatherings, or displays, 2. Goods, services, or programs, and 3. Transportation services. The bill allows the Department of Justice to intervene in equal protection actions in federal court on account of sexual orientation or gender identity. The bill prohibits an individual from being denied access to a shared facility, including a restroom, a locker room, and a dressing room that is in accordance with the individual's gender identity. If the act ever passes, it will require women who identify as men to have access to men's-only housing, dorms, restrooms, locker rooms, dressing rooms, and gyms. I'm starting this video by mentioning the Equality Act because I would consider it to be the next big step that transgender advocates could take to advance their agenda in law. It is also the natural conclusion of transgender ideology, since if trans women are women, then all the laws against discriminating against women would need to apply to trans women as well. One way transgender ideology harms men is by allowing women in men's spaces, which creates ethical and privacy concerns. Many men have concerns about playing against women out of fear of unintentionally harming them. Men of virtue want to protect women, and allowing women in men's sports tells men they either have to closet their competitive drive or closet their desire to protect women, neither of which are good lessons to be teaching boys. If men wanted to avoid injuring women in contact sports, they would have to change the way they play. For example, I play basketball, and I've played basketball against females on occasion. There is a major difference in how the average male basketball player would have to play against the average female basketball player to avoid injuring her, since the average male is 5.5 inches taller and 29 pounds heavier in the US. Additionally, if the Equality Act were to pass, it would require women to have access to men's locker rooms, which would normalize men and women undressing in front of each other, which would damage men, women, and society as a whole. It would also be an invasion of privacy for men, as they should be able to undress without women being present. The Equality Act would also allow women in men's restrooms. For women who have not been in a men's restroom, you should know that in addition to single urinals, which sometimes have privacy dividers and sometimes do not, some bathrooms also have urinal troughs. Allowing women in such spaces would be really weird and an obvious invasion of privacy for men. Many men would also be uncomfortable allowing women in men's locker rooms and restrooms out of fear of a false allegation of sexual assault, which, even if proven false in a court of law, could cost the man significant time, energy, and money to fight, in addition to harming his reputation despite being acquitted. Moreover, what happens to the men who stand up against transgender ideology in order to protect women? Will they lose their jobs, be labeled bigots, or get sued? If the Equality Act passed and a male president of a college refused to allow trans women in women's dormitories and restrooms, he would likely be fired immediately, since his protection of female-only spaces would defy the Equality Act and leave the university open to lawsuits. The men who are brave enough to stand up for the protection of women's only spaces and the protection of children from damaging gender ideology, puberty blockers, and cross-sex hormones pay a social price, since they risk being labeled transphobic and bigoted. Additionally, transgender ideology affects almost every man indirectly, since men have mothers and many have sisters, daughters, aunts, grandmothers, sisters-in-law, and nieces, all of whom can be affected by allowing men and women's spaces. Virtuous men will have a desire to protect the women and girls they know, and laws such as the Equality Act, if passed, would force men to suppress that desire or face legal repercussions. Many men also have children who will at some point come into contact with this ideology, whether at school, in entertainment, or other public places, and they will be responsible for explaining to their children why only males are men and only females are women. Some men will have to handle situations of rapid onset gender dysphoria in their adolescent daughters. Other men may have to deal with their ex-wife socially transitioning their child who they have shared custody over. Some men will also have to deal with the tragic situation where their wife starts identifying as a man, which would be hard enough to deal with by itself, but becomes even more challenging when children are involved and feel like they lost their mother rather than gained a father. Clearly, there is no question that women are not the only gender harmed by trans ideology. And while the majority of the attention on the dangers of transgender ideology is rightfully focused on women and children, there is no denying the fact that adolescent and adult men are harmed by it as well. If you enjoyed this video, please subscribe and consider supporting me using the links in the description. Please consider watching some of my other videos, which should be on your screen right now.